Hello and welcome to Take a Beat. My name is Tirza and I'm the digital pastor here at IES, and I feel like we're going from like the highs of the anniversary to let's talk serious stuff, but we are talking about, I think this stems from uncomfortable conversations, and this is death, dying, and dealing with it. So I know it's like such a downer.
Very.
But I am here with Pastor Mike Rody and Katie Luke. Someone I wanted to say your maiden name, sorry.
Okay, people still do it.
But welcome and thanks for joining me. Pastor Mike is the king of uncomfortable conversations.
So they say. So they say.
So let's just kind of launch into it, because I don't really think about any other way but to just launch into it. So, like, how do you have difficult conversations about death with people, especially with your family?
See, in my family, there's not many difficult conversations. Like growing up in the house I grew up in, everything was talked about at the dinner table. I mean, we talked about sex, we talked about alcohol, we talked about drugs, we talked about dying and all those kinds of things at the dinner table, not necessarily all at the same time, but it was normal conversations like that. Now, I married into a family that has a hard time mentioning anything that starts with the letter D, and that's an interesting thing for me to observe, because that side of the family really was very uncomfortable. Like, you can't talk about death, because if you talk about death, then something bad might happen. It would all be your fault. Now, obviously, that's not the reality. That's not how they really think. But it's kind of the implied cultural baggage that came along. So, one of the things that really was powerful for me as a young person was that my dad would tell me all the time, Mike, we're getting older, and don't feel bad if I die younger, because we've got enough money for your mom, because she's going to live a long time, but I don't think we got enough money for both of us, so it's okay. And then we'd always hear my dad say, yeah, someday I just want to die. I want to get hit by a bus. I want to go out quick. That was the thing he'd always say. And as we got older, in his retirement, he did really well in the 90s, and I stopped hearing him say he was ready to die early to save money for my mom. He figured it was all okay. But the cool thing my dad did, which made things really easy, because he was so no problem talking about it, whenever they would go on a vacation, they would pack up their little Mazda Miata, pack the trunk for 2 weeks, and before they'd set out, they'd have me come over to the house, and he would always show me the folder in the front of his filing cabinet. The folder in the filing cabinet was everything I would need to know if they didn't make it back alive. And you know what? I didn't use it for years. It didn't cause anyone to die. But then when my dad did die in 2014, I got home a week later to the States, and I sat down with my mom in the office, and we opened the file drawer, and everything was there in the folder. And it was so easy to deal with. And so that experience really helped me a lot. And then I've been confronted here with so many people who really struggle to talk about someone might die. People die.
But that's the thing, though. Like, I remember going into one of my ministry classes, and the professor started with 1 out of 1 person dies.
Yeah.
But so I think, there are cultures where it's very difficult to talk about it, and there are also maybe some beliefs where, if you talk about it, it will happen. I was like, it'll happen anyways.
Yes, it does happen.
So how about you, Katie? How did you grow up talking or not talking about death?
Yeah, I mean, I'm the complete opposite of Pastor Mike, where my family did not sit around the dinner table and talk about anything. We did not have very deep and like type of conversations. We didn't address hard things. And so really, I think it wasn't until I came to Indonesia that I had that conversation with my parents of like, hey, so I'm moving across the world, and if something were to happen to me, here's what I want you to do. And here's who has this information, and here's the process for so-and-so. And so I was the one who kind of had to bring about the difficult conversation. But at the same time, I grew up in a family where my mom was sick since I was 14 years old, and she's had many close calls. And my brother was born like 3 months premature, and he flatlined so many times within his first year of life. And so we had to face it, but it was never talked about.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because I grew up, not only did we talk about it in our household, but for me, I went to so many funerals as a kid. So my grandfather was number 19 of 20. We've talked about that before.
Wow.
And so a lot of his siblings were dying when I was a kid. He was he was one of the young ones. And so the uncle's dying, the aunt is dying. There's 2 for each of that age group, but funerals were always the opportunity to see my cousins and eat really good family food, because man, that side of the family could do food. And so I also grew up with, not only did I have the easy discussion later on, but even as a little kid, going to a funeral was a good thing. I mean, it wasn't mournful. All of our family funerals were really a celebration of life, because we knew that they were going to heaven. I do remember one time we went to a funeral, and it wasn't so sure. It was the other side of my family, and it was like, it dawned on me, wow, for some people dying is a disaster.
Yeah.
And some people, they are lost.
Yeah.
But for those who go to be with the Lord, man, they are blessed. And for those kids to get to go to their funeral and see their cousins and eat all that food, they're blessed too, so it's good.
Yeah, I mean, I was a pastor's kid, and so I grew up going to weddings and funerals.
Yeah.
And then both my parents came from big families, and so there's always either someone getting married or someone dying. So yeah, and I think my parents were probably a lot more like Pastor Mike's family, where my parents talked about what should happen if grandma or grandma pass away, or if my dad or my mom pass away, what's the even the file. I had access to their safe since I was younger. My mom ingrained the combination in my head, and also I have all of the information that I needed to get, to do stuff, and which I didn't need to do when my dad passed, but when my mom passed, I had all of the information for banks and different things, and it made it easier that you've talked about it.
Yeah.
Easier as in the logistics, I know what to do.
Yeah.
Rather than being caught unaware, unprepared. Yeah. Do you talk to your kids about?
We've talked a little bit about it, because we were all in the car when I found out my dad died. And then I had to wait for a few hours to actually let everyone else know. But so we've talked about that as a family. We've talked about it, not as much probably as my dad did, but we have talked about. One thing that I really like, though, in Asia, or at least Southeast Asia, what I've seen in the Philippines and what I've seen here, is that when people do die, people gather, and they don't rush it. I think the American tradition has gone away, and nowadays a lot of people are even telling their kids, don't do anything for my. It's like, hey, we're not grieving for the sake of the dead person. We're really grieving for us. We need to grieve.
Yes.
And so whether it's a wake in the Philippines where people sit around, hang out, eat food and play cards, and look at the casket every now and then, or whether it's here where we go and we do services for a few nights. And I really think that sitting and talking is valuable. And I have to admit, I think it would be great if there were more kids at those events. In the Philippines, there's always lots of kids around for those. And I think it's really beneficial. They're not as uncomfortable with the reality of death. I was always shocked to find out when I got to college that even at a Bible school, there were people that had never been to a funeral. And here we are supposed to be preparing to pastor people. How could that be? I've been to dozens of funerals.
Actually, in college, as part of, I think that it was the Theology of Ministry Essentials, Alan Mueller. We did a field trip to a funeral home.
Really?
Yes. And we got to see how, or not see, but they tell us what's the process, what happens when someone dies. So I learned a lot of things that I didn't know that I needed to know that.
Yeah, when Pastor Dave pastored that little church in Napavine, his friend in the town next door ran the mortuary. So we got to go over there. I was like 12 or 13. We got to go over and hang out at the mortuary. Pretty cool.
I think I'd been to like 5 funerals in the States, and I've been to far more in Indonesia now.
Yeah, and I think it's also that togetherness, even when you don't really even know the person, but if it's the person related to that person, you still go
and support and
and
present.
Support, and be present. And I think there's also this whole idea of sitting with someone as they are grieving, and here, food definitely helps, but when you're there with people and I think for me that was probably the hard thing when my mom passed away, was because it was during COVID, right? So I got no one to sit with, and that was difficult because I was like, oh, okay. But I think you're just comparing that with when my dad passed. I remember just being there, and people from IES came, and my dad's church people, and family, and friends, and even friends or people that I haven't seen in a long time, things like that. I think that part of being with people as they are grieving.
That, I have kind of an outline that I use, because you think, people ask me all the time, well, Pastor Mike, what do I say if I go to a funeral, or if I go to a wake, or what do I say? It's like, you really don't need to say much. You need to be there. But here's my outline. What's your favorite memory about your mom? How is your dad?
I'm pretty sure you've asked me that.
Yeah, how has your dad influenced your life? How do you look like your parents? Those kinds of things. And just one of those 2 questions will usually start a cascade of conversation that's really good for the person. It's good to bring up good memories. There are times where people say, I don't have any good memories. And to that, you can say, man, I'm so sorry. I wish you could have had it different, but I'm really glad to see you here, honoring your parents just the same. And it opens up opportunities. It's amazing how, too, I've been to, when I was pastoring the States, sometimes I was asked to go speak at a funeral for someone I'd never met, whose family I didn't know, and maybe they had like 1 or 2 members of the family, and you're like, what do I do? Same outline. Have that conversation, and it's amazing. People who are grieving need to talk and share their stories, and it's so powerful. So that's kind of my little thing. And if someone who's watching this has someone pass away, I will probably come and ask them some kind of similar question.
And I think that that also flows into the idea of sitting with the person, being with the person, but also as the person who is grieving, it's okay to grieve. Scripture says that we're not to grieve like people who don't have hope, but we do grieve.
We still need to process
it takes a while. It takes a while.
It does.
I used to, pastoring, I assumed that for about 2 weeks people are getting a lot of attention.
Mm-hmm.
But usually after about 2 weeks I would try to follow up, because I know they're still grieving and other people have moved on. But
Yeah.
I don't think you ever actually move on from grief. It just, the pain dissipates and the good memories increase.
Yeah.
But you keep, grieving is part of living. It's the result of someone having had a good life and a good influence or a strong influence on you. So it's not bad to grieve. It's just kind of hard sometimes.
So how did you process and grieve when your dad passed away, and then help your family grieve as well? Because you were here when your dad passed away.
We were here. We were actually in the car on the way to go check out the school my kids were going to end up in.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like a big deal day, and I got a call from my mom, and we were about an hour away from the school, and I'm in the car and she tells me that my dad passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew that one of my sons was going to have an assessment test at the school, and I knew that we needed to hold it together. We needed to get through this day. So I sat in the car all the way there, toured the entire campus, just held it in the whole time. It was about 6 hours later, I said, hey, since Pastor Dave lives nearby, let's go drop by their house. And by then I had already WhatsApped him what was going on. And then we sat down. It's Pastor Dave, but it's also Uncle Dave for my kids. And we just shared and talked about it and cried. I finally got to cry a little bit. But I found that as in my role in our family, I had to carry a lot.
Yeah.
And so I did that. I know my wife would have liked me to stay and go with them, but I knew I needed to get home and take care of my mom.
Mm-hmm.
So that was like part of my role in my function in the family. I needed to get home and take care of her, so I took care of her. My family joined later, and then I remember driving out of my parents' house. I got to the end of the block, and I'm driving, and we're going to head back to Seattle. And I just about fell apart, I had to hang on. So I wouldn't say that I had an easy grieving thing. I didn't get to really fully grieve in that sense. But there's been numerous times along the way when I wasn't in a place to have to help manage things for my family, that I was able to just go through half a box of Kleenex, and just cry. There's lots of times where I think of my dad, where I think of, things he would have said, what he would have done, how he would have totally made fun of me for what I'm doing. Stuff like that. Every time I drink coffee, I think of my dad, because he used to tease me that I had coffee with my sugar, but now I just drink my coffee straight. So I'm kind of, I think he'd be okay with that. But yeah, I would say I'm still, even right now, I got teary eyes just thinking about it, because it's a moving thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think grief also happens, like you were sharing that, it's like your family members have had close calls.
Yeah.
And I think the process of dealing with it also happens when you're people have gone through a lot, a long sickness.
Yeah.
Or so how for you, how did you deal with it?
How did I deal with it?
Just the phrase dealing with it. It's just but
I guess for when my brother was born really early and dealing with that, I was so young, I didn't understand really what was happening. I knew he flatlined, I knew there was a possibility he wouldn't be there, but I don't know, I kind of had hope that he would be just fine. I knew he was in a good hospital, so I'm okay. I was a teenager who cared about her social life and all of that, so it wasn't at the front of my mind most of the time. But with my mom, as it's progressively gotten worse from time to time. I'm like, all right, I gotta talk to someone about it. And so when a new sickness comes or a new diagnosis or something, I just talk to a friend and share like, hey, I'm struggling with this. I need someone to pray with me. And so I've had, because it's not death, but it's the possibility of it. So people aren't necessarily aware that it's happening, right?
Yeah.
So I've had to like learn how to speak up about needing to process what is happening.
That's really good. I had a friend as a kid named Dave Searles, and he was very close with me, and he ended up with leukemia, and it came back. Came once, it came again, and then the third time around, it took his life. But in the process, the first time I was really with him, and then as we got older, it came again, and it was like hard. And the third time, I just didn't know how to deal with it. He was a year younger than me. I had just graduated from high school. I didn't deal with it well. But I am so glad that somehow it got arranged for me to go visit him in his hospital bed a week before he died. And I was able to just, interact with him. And a lot of people are afraid for that moment. But even if you haven't dealt with it well, you don't know what to say, be there, visit him. Because when he died, I knew I had been there. At least I hadn't done it well for the year leading up to that, but I was there, and I learned a lot from that experience. It's just a 19-year-old about the power of the powerful impact of people dying in your life that maybe not even related to you, but it's really important to be there and participate in that process.
Yeah, I think, for me, that was my dad being sick was the reason I came back to Jakarta back in 2013. My dad passed away in 2014. Like, parallel. But, because we also came to Jakarta in 2013. Just the same time. And Katie Cannon as well. But with my dad, he was sick. Like, the last year of his life, I was here. And I wasn't working at the time. And so I had like front row seats to what he was going through, and even just the ups and downs. And we knew that there was a possibility, because when I was still in the States, he had already flatlined once. And that was why I came back. And so even just going through that, and not just being there for my mom as she was taking care of my dad, because he wasn't letting anyone else take care of him, and then being with my dad, who was struggling with his I might die thing, and that was also like a process. And I think for me, one of the things that I saw was people, especially people who are struggling with that, prolonged sickness, whatever, they're also they struggle. And even my dad was a pastor, but he was questioning and asking God, and sometimes he's just so frustrated at God, and I was sitting there and I was like, oh, this is what's happening. And that was eye-opening, but also it was interesting sitting with him as he was going through all of that. But for me, in terms of the grieving, I don't think I grieved well when my dad passed. I was just went back to work. And then I didn't end up grieving, letting myself grieve until afterwards, a month after or two. But it's very interesting. And so I have another question. Both of you at one point or another work with kids. How do you talk to kids about death, dying?
For my experience, you don't tend to have very many conversations about them unless they're your own kids. Or if someone has passed away in a kid's family and the parents say, hey, come and talk. the best conversations I've had with kids in that context are at an event where we're mourning somebody. I remember going out to a wake way out east of Jakarta. I can't remember, but that one of those places out there, and talking with a family and talking with their kids, and then talking with their kids a few other times after that. And it's really interesting to see how mental age development affects grief. And some kids just don't know what to do, and some kids are heavy into the emotions, but different kids are different. But if there's not open ability to have conversation, it's really hard to assess. Some kids feel like they have to carry the weight of the whole family. And you know, an 8-year-old boy cannot do that.
That's heavy.
And you know, they need to be able to let loose. And sometimes they can't talk to their parents, but they need to talk to an aunt and uncle or a pastor or someone who cares about them. It usually helps if it's someone they have a pretty good relationship with, and that's pretty fruitful.
For me, I honestly haven't needed to talk to kids about it yet. So thank God I haven't needed to. And I pray that the Holy Spirit would give me wisdom as I do when I do need to. Yeah.
I think we kind of need to wrap up. Like, I just wanted to start talking about it and encourage you who are listening to start talking about it with your kids and in your family, whether it is to prepare yourself for when you pass, because that's again the fact of life, or even processing when other people die or have gone through critical illness and things like that. And before I close, I do want to make this comment. The funeral homes in Indonesia, in Jakarta, like, I just love the names.
What are some of the names?
Well, actually, the
There's
one,
Grand Heaven, there's Oasis.
yeah. And then there's San Diego Hills. I'm sorry, I was like, where did that come from?
San Diego, of course.
Of course.
Maybe in the 60s.
But it's always interesting whenever we're like, oh yeah, where are you going, heaven? Or Grand Heaven. So, I think those are the names that come to mind. I don't know, are there any others?
I think there's a few, but
I feel like those ones are just kind of pops them all. Anyways, thank you so much for joining me as we talk about, and we should talk about, death, dying, and dealing with it. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week for another episode of Take a Beat.